Willowbrook is a small town nestled among the lush green hills of rural America, where life seems to have paused in time. The town's main street, paved with old cobblestones, winds past shops with worn brown rooftops, where the locals still maintain a simple lifestyle reminiscent of centuries past. Ancient oak trees stand silently along the road, forming a natural barrier that brings an unusual sense of tranquility. During the day, Willowbrook appears to be bathed in the soft golden light of the sun, with dry leaves falling along the paths, creating a gentle rustling sound underfoot. But as dusk falls, the town takes on an eerie stillness, as if some invisible force is holding all life at bay. Streetlights glow dimly, swallowed by the darkness, leaving only shifting shadows on the empty roads. At the heart of the town stands Belle boutique, Evelyn Grant's vintage fashion store, looming like a mysterious building among the old houses. The store's large glass windows reflect the faint light from the street lamps, but inside, it is dark and strangely gloomy. Classic wedding gowns are carefully displayed on wooden stands, yet their lavish beauty seems overshadowed by the heavy atmosphere that fills the space. Evelyn Grant, a young woman with a passion for antiques, inherited the store from her late mother. Despite her love for the vintage charm of Belle's boutique, Evelyn always felt that something was off. Every time she entered the shop at night, she had the sensation of being watched from the darkness. Sudden cold drafts would blow through, even though the doors remained firmly closed. The dim light from the old lamps in the store only added to the gloomy atmosphere. One evening, when Evelyn decided to reorganize the old storage room in the shop, she discovered a large wooden box covered in dust, hidden away in the darkest corner. A shiver ran down her spine as she opened the box. Inside, a vintage wedding dress lay, an ivory gown with intricately detailed craftsmanship, seemingly hand-stitched by a skilled artisan. Yet, its beauty could not hide the eerie feeling it exuded. The dress radiated an inexplicable coldness, and despite the stifling heat of the room, Evelyn could feel the chill gripping her skin. She examined the dress closely, and her eyes caught a faint stain on the bodice. It resembled the trace of a tear-or, perhaps even blood that had seeped through the fabric over time. A heavy, invisible weight pressed on her chest. Evelyn couldn't explain why, but she knew that this dress had once belonged to someone, a bride who was never destined to find happiness. The dark and silent room suddenly became more suffocating. The light from the only lamp in the room flickered and then went out, leaving Evelyn in complete darkness. Her heart pounded faster, and she gasped for breath, feeling as if someone was standing right behind her. A cold breeze swept through, and for a brief moment, she heard a whisper echoing through the air, like a distant murmur. "Give it back." Evelyn turned around quickly, but there was no one there. However, the wedding dress in her hands felt heavier, as if an invisible force was pulling it down. Trembling, she closed the box and hurried out of the storage room, horror closing in around her. She knew from that moment on, nothing in her life would ever be the same. Evelyn couldn't shake off the chilling feeling as she looked at the wedding dress she had found in the storage room of Belle's boutique. The ivory gown lay gently in her hands, but it was more than just an ordinary antique. Its beauty, with intricate details made from handcrafted lace and faded silver trims, gave it an ethereal glow, evoking images of a long-ago wedding. Yet, its perfection was marred by a strange coldness, as if decades of time had left behind traces of a tragedy. Evelyn carefully touched the dress, her fingers gliding over the soft fabric. A piercing coldness spread from her fingertips up her arm, causing her to pull back as if she had touched something vile. The moment her hand made contact with the gown, a gust of cold wind swept through, her long hair gently lifted in the enclosed space of the storage room, where not a single gap allowed air to enter. She froze, standing still for a few seconds, listening to the faint sound of the wind. A sense of unease quickly crept over her, but she reassured herself that it was just her imagination. For a brief moment, Evelyn felt as though someone was standing right behind her, breathing softly, just enough to make the air around her stir. Her heart raced, and just as she was about to turn around, a mysterious whisper reached her. "Is faint, yet strangely clear. Give it back." She quickly carried the dress out of the storage room, deciding to display it in the shop. Although the fear lingered, Evelyn couldn't deny the strange allure of the gown. There was something about it that she simply couldn't look away from. She thought that displaying it might attract customers' attention, but she didn't realize that this act would open the door to a series of terrifying events. When Evelyn placed the dress on the display stand in the center of the shop, the light from the ceiling shone down on it, making it shimmer in an eerie way. The dress seemed to emit a faint glow, like a living entity waiting for something. Its shadow cast on the wall, shifting between clear and blurry forms. That night, after locking up the shop and going home, Evelyn found herself unable to sleep. She lay in bed, but her mind kept spinning with images of the dress. She recalled the whisper, "Give it back," echoing in her head, leaving her restless. Every time she closed her eyes, she could vaguely see the image of a bride wearing that dress, standing motionless in the darkness. The bride's face was obscured by a veil, but her eyes seemed to be staring directly at Evelyn through the thin fabric. Around midnight, the phone rang, shattering the silence. Evelyn sat up abruptly, her heart pounding. The phone rang for a few seconds, but when she answered, there was only the sound of gentle breathing on the other end, followed by an unnerving silence. Goosebumps spread across her body as the fear within her began to grow. The next morning, when she returned to the shop, Evelyn noticed that the wedding dress on the display stand had been moved. The dress was still there, but it was no longer positioned as neatly as when she had placed it. It looked as if someone had touched it and dragged it slightly. A chill ran down her spine as she wondered if she had been careless. But deep down, she knew that something terrible had begun, and it was connected to that wedding dress. The atmosphere in Belle's boutique became stranger than ever. Evelyn tried to reassure herself that all her unease was just a product of her imagination. But strange signs began to appear, and gradually, things took a turn for the worse. At first, it was just small, seemingly harmless incidents. When Evelyn stayed late to arrange the merchandise, she would often hear light footsteps on the wooden floor, even though the shop was locked up. Every time she paused to listen, the footsteps would stop immediately. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she would hear knocking on the front door. But when she checked, there was only the empty street and the thick darkness outside. The lights in the shop flickered constantly. The ceiling lights above flashed uncontrollably, especially when she stood near the wedding dress. Worse yet, shadows seen out of the corner of her eye would make Evelyn jump. Each time she turned around, there was nothing there, just the rows of wedding dresses hanging silently and motionless. Yet the feeling that something was watching her from some hidden corner of the store never faded. These strange occurrences unsettled Evelyn, but she tried to brush off her worries. Until one day, a young woman named Clara, a customer of the store, came to try on the newly displayed wedding dress. Clara was immediately drawn to it. Her eyes lit up as she touched the soft fabric, mesmerized by its eerie beauty. Under the warm, yellow lights of the shop, Clara smiled with delight as she stood in front of the mirror, admiring herself in the vintage gown. Evelyn, standing beside her, was smiling, but the sense of unease continued to grow within her. As she watched Clara wearing the dress, an image flashed through her mind, the silhouette of the bride from Evelyn's dream, standing by the river, eyes empty. She blinked, trying to push the image away, but the eerie feeling lingered. Suddenly, Clara felt a chill. She rubbed her arms, her lips trembling. "I feel so cold," she said in a hoarse voice. Evelyn looked around the shop. All the windows were shut, and the air conditioning had been turned off earlier. There was no way a breeze could enter. Yet, Clara continued to shiver, and suddenly, her expression grew confused, as if she was seeing something inexplicable. Evelyn rushed to Clara's side, frantically checking if she was seriously injured. Clara, trembling with fear, clung tightly to the stair railing. Her face was pale, and her voice shook uncontrollably. "Someone pulled me," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "I didn't fall. I was pulled by an invisible hand." Clara's words sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. An invisible hand. She looked around the shop, her eyes searching for any sign of another presence. But there was nothing except the silence and the murky darkness that filled the space. The wedding dress still lay on the display stand, silent as always, but now it seemed to emit an ominous aura. A suffocating heaviness that made it hard for Evelyn to breathe. Clara quickly pulled the dress off, all the excitement and fascination gone from her eyes. "I don't want this dress anymore." "Never," she said shakily, then hurried out of the shop without looking back. Evelyn stood still, fear swelling within her. Something was wrong with the dress. This event was not a coincidence. And deep down, Evelyn began to realize that there was a dark force hidden within the wedding dress. A force she couldn't understand. Since the incident with Clara, Evelyn had been plagued every night by strange and haunting dreams. Each time she fell asleep, she found herself standing by a misty river, where thick fog swirled over the water. The darkness of the night enveloped everything, with only the faint moonlight reflecting on the ink-black surface of the river. The river was calm, yet for some reason, it made Evelyn feel suffocated, as if something terrifying was hidden beneath its waters. In the dream, she always saw a young girl standing on the opposite bank. The girl wore a pristine white wedding dress, her slender figure seemingly pushed back by the wind. A veil covered her face, but Evelyn could feel the bride's eyes staring directly at her. The eyes were empty, as cold as ice, and deep within them was a profound sense of despair. Each time Evelyn tried to approach the girl, the bride would step further back towards the river. From her pale, withered lips, not a single word was spoken. But Evelyn could hear the whispers echoing in the air, a voice that seemed soaked in the cold wind. "Give it back." The bride's fragile hand reached out to Evelyn, but the closer she got, the more the bride stepped toward the icy waters, as if preparing to plunge in. The dreams became increasingly real. Evelyn could feel the icy coldness from the river spreading across her skin, could smell the dampness rising from the water's surface, and every time she saw the bride, a heavy weight pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Many nights, Evelyn would wake up, gasping for breath, sweat pouring down her face, her heart racing as if she had just escaped from a horrifying nightmare. However, the nightmare didn't stop there. Every time Evelyn touched the wedding dress in the shop, the image of the bride from her dreams became clearer, as if the girl did not just exist in her sleep, but had begun to invade her mind even when she was awake. Evelyn often felt an icy hand touching her back when she stood near the dress, or heard the soft sound of footsteps echoing around the shop when no one else was there. The shadows in the stores seemed to stretch longer, and in every dark corner, she always felt as though the bride's hollow eyes were watching her. Then, on a stormy, rainy night, as Evelyn sat in her living room, cold winds blew in through the window, accompanied by a murmur like people whispering. She closed the window, but the whispering did not stop. "Give it back to me." The voice echoed in her head, clearer than ever before. It was no longer a distant whisper, but a distinct, chilling voice, as if someone was standing right beside her. Evelyn rushed out of the living room, feeling as though something was clinging to her from behind. When she turned around, there was nothing but darkness. However, as she glanced at the mirror on the wall, she saw a figure standing right behind her, the bride in the white dress. The bride's skin was pale, droplets of water trickling down from her soaking wet hair. Her face was streaked with tears, and from her withered lips, that voice spoke again. This time not just inside Evelyn's head. "Give it back to me." Suddenly, the image in the mirror vanished, and Evelyn felt herself being pulled to the floor. Panic consumed her as she realized that the spirit of the bride, whom she had come to know as Rose Callahan, was still trapped within the wedding dress. Rose's death had not just been a tragic end for a young bride. It was a curse that had never been lifted. Evelyn understood that Rose wanted something back. But what? And how could she help the restless spirit when she didn't fully comprehend the horrifying truth behind Rose's death? Every night, Evelyn dreamed of standing by the river, with Rose still there. Her eyes hollow and her hands reaching out, a desperate plea for help. Shortly after the dreams of Rose began to consume Evelyn, the entire town of Willowbrook found itself caught up in a series of inexplicable, eerie phenomena. At first, it was just whispered comments from customers visiting Belle's boutique. Stories about a chill running down their spines as they passed through the shop's entrance. Or lights flickering briefly whenever they glanced at the wedding dress on display. But soon, these incidents became far more disturbing. A woman named Margaret, a regular customer of the shop, returned with a troubled expression. She recounted how, after purchasing a dress from the store, she had been plagued by nightmares every night. In her dreams, Margaret saw a bride in a white dress standing in the shadows, her hair drenched in dripping water, her eyes hollow and staring straight at her. The figure said nothing, but every time Margaret awoke, she felt as if she had just escaped an indescribable horror. What was even more terrifying was that Margaret was not the only one reporting these haunting dreams. Gradually, more customers began sharing their nightmares with Evelyn. All of them described the same image: a bride standing in the darkness, calling their names in a chilling whisper. Some even mentioned hearing the sound of dripping water in their dreams, as if the bride had just emerged from some deep, cold place. Evelyn realized that Rose's spirit was not just haunting her, but had begun spreading throughout the town, affecting anyone connected to the dress. The nightmares were just the beginning. Strange occurrences started happening around Willowbrook, particularly at Belle's boutique. One morning, as Evelyn opened the store, a large chandelier suddenly fell from the ceiling, shattering into pieces on the wooden floor. Though the incident terrified her, what made her shudder even more was the fact that the chandelier had shown no signs of damage before. It had swayed gently for years, but now it seemed as though some invisible force had pulled it down. The strange occurrences grew more pronounced each day. Mirrors in the shop began to show inexplicable cracks. Evelyn distinctly remembered that no one had touched the large mirror in the fitting room. Yet one morning, it was shattered with jagged lines running across its surface. Every time she looked at those cracks, Evelyn felt as though thousands of unseen eyes were staring back at her from the other side, where darkness lurked. These phenomena cast an even gloomier and heavier atmosphere over the boutique. Customers grew increasingly uneasy whenever they stepped inside, and rumors of the cursed dress started to spread throughout the town. Some townsfolk even avoided walking past the shop, as if it had become a dark spot of fear. But what horrified Evelyn the most was an accident involving a young woman named Lily. Lily had tried on the wedding dress during a visit to the shop, and soon afterwards, she suffered a bizarre accident. On her way home, she fell down her own staircase, breaking both her leg and arm. With a trembling voice, Lily recounted that just before the fall, she felt something pull at her leg. A cold, unseen hand had grabbed her from the shadows. This coincidence was too clear to ignore. Evelyn began to understand that the dress was not just a haunting decoration, but carried with it a terrible curse. A heavy sense of guilt weighed on her as she realized that she had inadvertently opened the door for Rose's spirit to return to the world of the living. And now Rose was spreading terror to anyone who dared come near the dress. Knowing she couldn't let this continue, Evelyn decided to delve deeper into the dress's past. She had to uncover the truth about Rose Callahan and her tragic death. Where did the curse begin? And was there a way to free this trapped spirit before it was too late? Evelyn knew that the dress and Rose's death held many secrets yet to be revealed, and she needed to uncover them before an even greater disaster struck. Evelyn knew that to break the curse of the dress and end the horrifying events that were unfolding, she had to dig deeper into the past of Rose Callahan. She began searching through the town's historical records, old documents, and the stories passed down by the locals. Piece by piece, the story emerged, painting a grim picture of the young woman's tragic fate. Rose Callahan, a beautiful and gentle girl, lived in Willowbrook at the end of the 19th century. She was born into a wealthy family, but her life was far from happy. Rose's parents, who cared only about financial gain, forced her into marriage with a wealthy man named Edward Montrose. Edward was a successful businessman, but he was known to be ruthless and cold-hearted. Rose did not love Edward. Her heart belonged to another young man, but her parents forbade the relationship. They arranged the marriage, leaving Rose with no choice but to comply with her family's demands. The wedding day drew near, and Rose was forced to wear the ivory wedding dress, the very dress that now lay silently in Evelyn's boutique. It had been custom-made for Rose, a masterpiece of beauty and elegance, but to her, it felt like a trap. She knew that marrying Edward would be the end of her dreams and her freedom. On the night before the wedding, Rose could no longer bear the weight of it all. When everyone was asleep, she secretly left the house in her wedding dress, running towards the river at the edge of town to a place where she and the man she loved had once promised to be together. But that dream had long since vanished, and Rose knew that she could never escape the fate her family had arranged for her. Under the cold moonlight, Rose stood at the riverbank, her eyes filled with tears as she gazed at the dark waters below. Her heart broke as she thought of the life she was being forced into, and in her most desperate moment, she decided to free herself. Rose jumped into the river, still wearing her wedding dress, and never resurfaced. Rose's death shocked the entire town. People whispered about the sudden passing of the young bride, and some locals began to claim that they saw Rose's figure standing by the river every night, like a restless spirit that could not find peace. But what was even more terrifying was the legend that began to spread about the wedding dress. It was said that Rose's soul had become trapped within the gown. Anyone who wore it would be doomed to suffer the same tragic fate and face the horrifying destiny that Rose had endured. Evelyn flipped through each page, every old and yellowed record weighing down the air around her, She had found articles from old newspapers documenting Rose's death and the rumors about the wedding dress becoming a vessel for her vengeful spirit. There were accounts of women who had tried on the dress and subsequently encountered strange accidents, from sudden deaths to inexplicable mishaps. Evelyn realized that the dress was not just a cursed object. It was the bridge between Rose's spirit and this world. Rose's soul had never been freed, and she continued to seek some form of salvation. This was why anyone who touched the dress became haunted by her presence, because Rose was desperately trying to find help, or, at the very least, an escape from her enduring pain. This realization sent a shiver through Evelyn. She understood that the dress carried a soul filled with hatred and despair. Rose did not just seek revenge for the life that had been stolen from her. She also longed to escape the terrifying existence she had been trapped in for so many years. The question was, how could Evelyn help Rose find release? And if she couldn't, would this curse continue to plague the town of Willowbrook forever? Evelyn sat there, silently staring at the wedding dress resting on the display stand. Her eyes darkened as she once again felt Rose's presence, terrifying and inescapable. She knew she had to confront Rose's spirit and find a way to break the curse before everyone, including herself, became the next victim of the cursed dress. After learning about Rose's death and the curse bound to the wedding dress, Evelyn became obsessed with finding a way to free the spirit of the unfortunate girl. Sleepless nights and a growing fear within her made Evelyn realize that if she couldn't find a way to break the curse, Rose would continue to haunt not just her, but the entire town of Willowbrook. Late one night, Evelyn decided to stay at the store to research rituals that might free the spirit. Her desk was covered with ancient texts, writings on spiritual ceremonies, and notes from folklore legends. The shop was cloaked in darkness, with only the dim light of her desk lamp casting a pale glow, making the shadows of the displayed wedding dresses dance eerily around her. The silence in the room was unnervingly thick. Every time Evelyn turned a page, it felt as if the surrounding sounds faded into nothingness. She tried to focus, but the cold seemed to crawl across her skin, like an invisible chill brushing past her. She told herself it was just a trick of the mind, a result of her exhaustion making her overly sensitive. Then, suddenly, she felt an icy hand on her shoulder. The piercing cold sank into her flesh, making her shudder. Evelyn whipped around, but there was no one there. Only the racks filled with wedding dresses and the oppressive darkness that surrounded them. She stood up, holding her breath and listening, but there was no sound except for her own ragged breathing. Fear crept into every vein, but Evelyn forced herself to stay calm. She turned back to her desk, intending to sit down when, all of a sudden, the shop's lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into complete darkness, leaving only the faint glow from the window outside. The silence was terrifying, and in that moment, Evelyn knew she was no longer alone. In the dim light, from the corner of her eye, Evelyn saw a familiar silhouette moving toward her. The dark figure emerged gradually, as if stepping out of a thick mist. It was Rose, the young bride in the drenched wedding dress, her long hair hanging loose, and her skin pale as death. Her hollow eyes were fixed on Evelyn, as if searching for an answer. "Rose," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. But Rose did not respond. Instead, she moved closer, slowly, like a ghost floating just above the ground. Her face was streaked with tears, yet devoid of any life, filled only with an overwhelming hatred. Rose began to murmur inaudible words, each syllable dripping with years of suppressed resentment. The whispers echoed through the room like sounds from another world, pulling Evelyn into what felt like an inescapable nightmare. "Give it back to me," Rose said, her voice becoming clearer and sharper. Each word cut deep into Evelyn's mind like a knife. She wanted to respond, but her throat was choked tight, preventing her from uttering a single word. Then, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, numbing Evelyn's entire body. The wind didn't come from outside, but from Rose's very presence. Evelyn felt as if an invisible storm was swirling around her. She tried to step back, but her legs felt frozen. Before she could react, the wind grew so strong that it knocked her down to the floor. She fell hard, a sharp pain radiating from her back as her body slammed against the hard wooden surface of the floor. As Evelyn struggled to sit up, Rose's figure had vanished, but the cold air, thick with the scent of river water and death, still lingered. She lay there, her heart pounding in her chest, filled with fear and despair. It was clear that Rose was not just seeking liberation. Her spirit had been trapped in anger and pain for decades. And now, she wanted more than the Tros wanted, to reclaim something she had lost and would not stop until she achieved it. Evelyn knew that she didn't have much time left. If she didn't quickly find a way to free Rose's spirit, the town of Willowbrook, along with everyone connected to the wedding dress, would face an inevitable catastrophe. Evelyn had reached her breaking point. The strange occurrences, the haunting dreams, and Rose's presence had pushed her into a state of physical and mental exhaustion. She knew that if she didn't confront Rose and find a way to end the curse, not only she, but the entire town of Willowbrook would be forever haunted. This was the final confrontation, and Evelyn was mentally prepared for the worst. Tonight, Belle's boutique was completely empty, the silence almost terrifying. Evelyn stood in the vast room, the light from outside failing to penetrate, leaving only darkness enveloping everything. The ivory wedding dress, the source of all the calamity, lay silently on the display stand like a lifeless object. But Evelyn knew it was not inert. It seemed alive, waiting. She didn't know exactly what would happen, but a part of her was ready. Carefully, she placed the wedding dress in the center of the floor, as if inviting Rose's spirit to appear one last time. In the thick darkness, Evelyn sat down, her hands gripping the edge of the chair, her heart pounding in her chest. She listened to the stillness, feeling the cold creeping through every crack. Time stretched on, each moment seeming to last an eternity. Suddenly, a laugh echoed from a distant, dark corner of the shop. It was not a gentle or joyful laugh, but a twisted, maniacal cackle, as if rising from the depths of despair and hatred. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. She turned her head, trying to locate the source of the sound, but saw nothing but darkness. Then, from the shadows, a figure gradually emerged, clearer than ever before. It was Rose, the bride in the white wedding dress, her face drenched with river water and her hair matted into long strands. But this time, Rose's gaze was no longer empty. Her eyes were pitch black and deep, filled with a burning resentment like flames flickering in the darkness. Rose moved closer to Evelyn, her steps graceful yet imbued with the power of a supernatural force. In Rose's hand was a white wedding veil, but it was no longer soft and delicate as before. It had transformed into an instrument of revenge, the veil tightly wrapped in Rose's grip like a direct threat. With each step, Rose took closer. The air in the room felt suffocating, heavy with tension. Evelyn tried to stand up, but her legs felt frozen. Her heart raced in her chest as she realized she couldn't escape. Rose was too close, and this time, She wasn't coming for help. She was here to reclaim what belonged to her. "Give it back to me," Rose screamed, her voice echoing throughout the space, sharp and filled with hatred. The sound reverberated into every corner, causing the entire shop to tremble. Evelyn felt as if her chest was being squeezed by an invisible hand, her breath becoming labored, and her entire body began to tremble. Rose continued to advance, the wedding veil tightening in her grip as if ready to choke Evelyn. Her face was streaked with tears, but devoid of any humanity. The resentment had transformed her soul into a terrifying entity, intent on avenging her tragic life. Evelyn felt the icy coldness spreading throughout her body, numbing her senses. She knelt down, unable to move, unable to speak, as if Rose's invisible hand was gradually tightening around her throat. Everything seemed to blur before Evelyn's eyes. She could hear her own ragged breaths mingling with Rose's thunderous screams. She struggled to shout, but the words were stuck in her throat. Time felt like it had frozen, leaving only darkness and despair enveloping her. In that final moment, when death seemed to be closing in, Evelyn suddenly realized something. She understood that Rose did not just seek release. She wanted to reclaim what had been stolen from her: love, freedom, and her life. Evelyn concentrated, despite everything around her fading away. She cried out, her voice weak yet filled with determination. "Rose, I will help you. Let me help you." The invisible hand paused for a moment. Rose halted, her deep black eyes locking onto Evelyn's, as if searching for a glimmer of hope. But the darkness still loomed, and the hatred within Rose's soul was not easily dispersed. After the terrifying confrontation with Rose's spirit, Evelyn knew she couldn't tackle the curse weighing down the dress and Rose's unfortunate soul alone. She sought the help of a local spiritual expert, Agnes, an elderly woman renowned for her ancient rituals and ability to communicate with the other side. Agnes listened to Evelyn's story with grave seriousness. After researching Rose and the cursed dress, she explained that Rose's soul was trapped between two worlds, unable to find peace due to her hatred and despair. The only way to free that spirit was to reenact the wedding ceremony that Rose never completed. Evelyn would have to take Rose's place in this final ritual, replicating Rose's last act by the river where she had ended her life. That night, Evelyn and Agnes made their way to the river at the edge of Willowbrook, where the legend said that Rose had jumped to end her life. The cold night wind whipped through the air, carrying an eerie chill from the dark waters flowing slowly beneath the dim moonlight. Dressed in Rose's wedding dress, Evelyn felt waves of cold spreading throughout her body, not only from the air, but also from the spirit that still lingered in every thread of the gown. Agnes began the ritual with ancient prayers, her voice resonating through the darkness, mingling with the sound of the wind and the flowing water. Guided by Agnes, Evelyn slowly stepped into the icy river. The cold water cut through the fabric of the wedding dress, making Evelyn shiver, but she did not stop. She knew this was the only way to free Rose. When the water reached her knees, Evelyn paused and closed her eyes, concentrating on Agnes's incantation. Her trembling hands clutched the wedding veil tightly. She imagined herself in Rose's place, a desperate girl forced into a fate she never wanted. The heavy weight of resentment and sorrow bore down on her, but at the same time, Evelyn felt a fragile hope that Rose might finally find peace. In that moment, Evelyn heard soft footsteps by the riverbank. She opened her eyes and saw Rose. But this time, Rose's figure was no longer filled with hatred. She stood there, her eyes filled with sadness, but no longer empty. Tears still streamed down her cheeks, but the pitch-black eyes had vanished, replaced by a gaze filled with longing for release. Evelyn sensed that Rose had accepted her help. The young bride's spirit stepped into the river, moving closer to Evelyn. As she approached, Rose reached out and touched Evelyn's hand. Her cold touch carried no trace of malice. In the faint moonlight, Rose whispered to Evelyn, but this time her voice was not laced with sharp resentment. Instead, it was a thank you, a final farewell. Evelyn looked at Rose, seeing a profound sadness in her eyes, but also a sense of relief. Rose slowly stepped back, her form gradually fading into the night, piece by piece, until she disappeared completely. The curse had been broken. Evelyn stood there in the frigid water, feeling a sense of relief spreading through the space, as if the river had washed away all the pain and resentment from Rose's soul. The sky above gradually returned to its inherent tranquility, and the wind no longer carried the cold breath of the dead. Evelyn knew that Rose had been freed. She was no longer trapped in the wedding dress, no longer wandering in search of salvation in the darkness. A sense of peace spread throughout Evelyn's body as she slowly stepped out of the river. The wedding dress heavy with water, but now rendered harmless. Rose's curse had been lifted, and at last she could rest in peace. After Rose's spirit was freed, the town of Willowbrook returned to its usual tranquility. The strange accidents and haunting dreams seemed to have come to an end. Belle's boutique remained open, and Evelyn, though still weary from all she had been through, felt relieved knowing that she had helped Rose find peace. Customers gradually returned to the shop, but no one dared to mention the cursed wedding dress anymore. However, something still lingered. Each night, as darkness fell and the town sank into eerie silence, Evelyn could sense an invisible presence hovering around the shop. Faint whispers echoed in the dark corners of Belle's boutique, sometimes sounding like rustling wind, other times more succinctly the melancholic sigh of someone. Even though she had helped Rose's spirit move on, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that another darkness, deeper and more dangerous, still existed. One night, as Evelyn was locking up after a late shift, she stood at the door, looking out at the quiet street. The silver moonlight reflected off the distant river, and she suddenly sensed something unusual. She looked closer, and on the riverbank, in the dim light, a slender figure stood motionless. Evelyn held her breath as she realized it was the silhouette of a bride, her white dress fluttering in the wind. Her eyes fixed on the dark water. Her heart raced, but this time, she didn't feel the hatred emanating from that silhouette. Instead, it was a deep sorrow, a reminder of what had transpired. Evelyn told herself that perhaps it was just an illusion, the final trace of the painful memories that Rose had left behind. But the figure did not vanish. It stood there, silently by the river, like a quiet warning. Rumors about the bride by the river began to circulate once more throughout the town. People claimed that occasionally they would see a bride standing still by the riverbank on bright moonlit nights. But when they approached, she would disappear into the air. Strange whispers continued to be heard in the old houses of Willowbrook, and a sudden chill still swept through Evelyn's shop every night as darkness fell. As time went on, Evelyn felt that the darkness enveloping the town was not just from Rose. It was deeper, more complex, as if a greater force lurked behind Rose's story, a curse that had never been fully broken, even after helping to free the spirit of the young bride. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that Willowbrook had long been haunted by another, more profound darkness. Standing in her shop, she gazed out at the night sky. She wondered if Rose was truly at rest and whether the curse had indeed ended. The shadows seemed to linger, silently yet dangerously, waiting for an opportunity to return. She knew that while Willowbrook appeared peaceful during the day, it still harbored a dark past that could not easily be erased. The bride by the river would likely never completely vanish. And Evelyn, despite her efforts to help, remained trapped in the haunting realization that something worse loomed just beyond the horizon.